Hi, welcome to this second lecture for our first assignment on the materials from Mark Blyth that I provided in our course. Uh, so last time I've been talking about in general Mark Blyth's idea that there are two capitalist computers, one in 1945 to 1980, the Great Compression capitalism computer, and then another in 1980 to 2008, what you might call the neoliberalism, the neoliberal capitalism computer. And remember, Mark Blyth has this idea that these computers start out with a bug that gets worse and worse throughout the lifetime of the computer, and then at some point things get so bad that there needs to be a system reset, and you need to go and buy a new computer and set up a new way of organizing and operating the economy. Remember the Great Compression capitalist computer? It was, its motivating, animating ideal was to secure full employment, and that's in response to the previous economic collapse, the Great Depression, and ensuing World War II. The idea is if you have full employment, you're not going to have something like the Great Depression again, and you also are going to be able to keep fascism and communism at bay. But as we saw, this 1945 to 1980 capitalism computer, it had a bug that resulted in this wage price spiral that I described, and this capital strike, where there are these investors, these capital investors who don't want to put their money anywhere because the inflation just keeps eating away their returns. And so in come Reagan and Thatcher. There's a movement, there's a political movement to restore the ability of this capitalist market to generate productive investment opportunities where inflation doesn't eat away any of these investments. And so in 1980, you get a whole set of policies that constitute a new computer. And the key goal of this new computer, if you look at the slide here, you look at the column for neoliberal capitalism, one of the key goals of this computer is to manage inflation. Okay, now there are a number of ways that inflation can be managed. One way is through the central banks of various of the economy. So Canada has its own central bank. The United States has its Federal Reserve, by far the most powerful central bank in the world right now. The European Union has a central bank. Any advanced industrialized large economy is going to have a central bank. There's a lot of different things that these entities do. One of the things they can do is that they can control inflation. They have levers that oftentimes can get traction on inflation or on what you might call the price. I'm sorry. Can get leverage on inflation. And one of the key imperatives of this system for the last 40 years or so has been to keep inflation under about 2% a year. And throughout the world, central banks have been very successful at doing this. They have achieved a kind of price stability. Now, these central banks, they have a lot of different tools to do the various things that they do. I don't want to go too deep in the weeds on this, but let me say a few things they can do. And there's one in particular that has an attenuated connection to controlling inflation, but it is one of the main ways that they control inflation. And this is the central bank's ability to set interest rates in an economy. Now, it's not like they can do this just, like they can just snap their fingers like Thanos, and that's the interest rate. But they can perform certain kinds of market operations that ultimately have the effect of having a kind of loose control of the interest rates that in turn is going to affect inflation. Let me see if I can just explain that for you a little bit. First, let me say what an interest rate is. So I think most of you folks will be familiar if you've taken out a student loan or you have a credit card, there's an interest rate, right, that you have to pay back whatever you've borrowed. So if you've borrowed $1,000 and you've done it on a credit card, and these credit cards are just horrible in the amount of interest rates they charge. You might be paying something like 22% interest. So if you don't pay off any of that over the course of a year, then the amount of money you owe is going to go up by 22%. So an interest rate is what you might call the price of money. Say, hey, I want to borrow $1,000, and the bank says, okay, yeah, I'll give you $1,000, but you're going to have, the price of that is that there's going to be a 22% interest rate attached to that, or something like that. So what the central banks can do is they can set basically the baseline interest rate in an economy. And by the way, the baseline interest rate right now in any industrialized country is way the heck lower than that credit card interest rate. It's going to be closer to zero. But anyway, they can set this price of money amount, this baseline price of money. Okay, now how does that relate to inflation? Well, so just think about the differences in the way investors are going to behave if that interest rate is higher or lower. Or actually, maybe to put this more carefully, think about the differences in the way in which folks wanting to take a risk, sort of an entrepreneurial risk, are going to behave if that interest rate goes higher or lower. If the interest rate is higher, then the price of money is higher. The risk of borrowing money and trying to make something work is a lot higher. It's just a lot tougher to be able to justify going out and trying to achieve this new entrepreneurial idea if the cost of money is too high. I really would open this restaurant, but I can only get a loan for 10%, and I just can't manage those payments. So I'm not going to do it. I have this great idea. I have my cold fusion idea. I have it all worked out. If I could only, get the money that's necessary to scale up the production, this would be great. But 10% is the best I can get. I can't do it. But on the other hand, it might be like, oh wow, I can get this. I can borrow this money for 2% interest or 3% interest a year. Yeah, I'm going to do it. There's this. I can make those payments. I can make that work. So the idea is, if the central bank raises the price of money, then it's going to tamp down the kind of activity in the economy. It's going to tamp down the amount of entrepreneurial activity. It's going to tamp down the investment, the investment activity in the economy. However, if it lowers interest rates, then people are going to be loaning money and accepting loans to go do all kinds of things, and the economy is going to get really hot. The price of money is going to, one way to put it, the price of money is going to be cheap. And the idea is that as money, if the interest rates go down, there's going to be a lot of loans put out there, and there's going to be a lot of activity. The economy is going to heat up, and that's actually going to create a kind of inflationary pressure. And what the central banks do is they sort of monitor what's going on, and if things start to get too hot in the economy, well, they're the ones that take away the punch bowl at the party, and they raise interest rates a little bit so that inflation doesn't get out of hand. Okay, now one of the reasons I mention this function, this capability of the Federal Reserve, is that it's going to relate to a part of the bug in this system. Because one thing to keep in mind is for the last 40 or 50 years or so, we've been in a very low interest rate environment. The Federal Reserve has seen no need to raise interest rates. In fact, they've been lowering interest rates as low as possible, getting very close to that zero number. And in some cases, actually, you've had negative interest rates here and there pop up. So we're in a very low interest rate environment, and we've been in a very low interest rate environment for a very long time, even though, and you should keep in mind that that low interest rate environment doesn't necessarily attach to how much the credit card companies are charging you. But one thing to keep in mind is when they're charging you 20 or 22% in this low interest rate environment, they're making a lot of profit off of those the interest rates they are charging. Okay. Anyway, but the key point is, that's a bit of a digression. The key point is the idea that the Federal Reserves, the central banks, can control these the interest rates, loosely control the interest rates in the economy. All right. Now, the past era, the Great Compression era, was something that Blyth described as a debtor's paradise. The current era, he sometimes described as a creditor's paradise. And here on in the slide, really, I have two things, but there's really one thing that's on that slide. That's the main thing that makes this a creditor's paradise. This era is a creditor's paradise because there's low inflation. And what that means is that when you make a loan to somebody, inflation's not going to erode away the real value of that loan, and so you're not going to be in the position like creditors were in the 70s, where inflation would just eat away the value of their loan very quickly. So if you loan, $10,000 in 1990 and 2000, that principal amount is going to be worth basically the same thing because you've had a very low rate of inflation through that time period. And then that low rate of inflation is going to be easily exceeded by your rate of interest. And so you'll be making money on this loan as opposed to having it eaten away by inflation. Now, another part of the picture, though, is that during this 1980 to 2008 time period, you've had stagnant wages for most people in the economy. Sort of, pretty much from like the 80th percentile and down, folks' wages are flat. If you look back at Blyth's lecture, you'll see he provides a number of slides that shows how flat wages have been in industrialized countries for basically the bottom 80% of the income distribution, really all the way up to about 90%. When we read David Schweikert, there's actually a part in the Schweikert reading that I didn't assign, but you have it there on Avenue to Learn, where he talks about inequality, and he has a lot of documentation of this same basic idea. Wages have basically been stagnant for folks in the bottom 80 to 90% for about 40 years. Now, why is that good for creditors? Well, it's good for creditors because you've got two things. First, you have this low inflation environment. If you make a loan, inflation's not going to erode it away, and you're going to be able to make a profit on it. But also, you have a whole bunch of folks with stagnant wages out there, and they need to make ends meet, and it's tough because wages are stagnant, so they're going to take out loans. They're going to take out loans, and so you're going to have a lot of clients. As a creditor, you're going to have a lot of loans out there. And in fact, something that's characteristic of the current age is private debt, consumption debt, unsecured and secured consumption debt has just continues to grow. It's grown a tremendous amount over the last 20 or 30 years or so. Okay. So you have this creditor's paradise where you have low inflation and you have stagnant wages. Now, another feature of this second capitalist computer is this era. It's characterized by growing inequality, growing inequalities in income and wealth. Now, why is that? Well, go to this next bullet point. One of the main mechanisms for this is labor's weak bargaining power with employers. And there's three things. There are a number of things, but I'm going to enumerate three that parallel the things that made the previous era such a advantageous position for debtors. So first, one thing that's happened is unions have been weakened. In the United States, this is most marked. I mentioned last time that you've gone from something like a 30-something% penetration rate in the private workplace to well below 10%. So collective bargaining isn't there to to strengthen the bargaining position of labor. Now employers can kind of make these bargains case by case, one at a time with employees, and that's a much weaker bargaining position to be in. The second thing is something that's really important that I think a lot of folks aren't aware of. In the previous era, it was very hard for big companies to move their capital to other countries, and so take their factory with them, take their production facilities with them. So they were stuck in place having to bargain with labor in their country. And it was easy for the states, the nations in which they're stuck, to regulate them. But now capital can say, hey, look, if you don't give us the wage or labor bargain that we want, we're just going to pack up and we're going to move. And that tremendously undercuts the ability of labor to bargain. So even when you do have unions that are able to collectively bargain, their position is weakened, and so their ability to demand and get these wage increases has been completely undercut. And of course, given the problems of the last system, this is very much intentional. Like, this was part of the idea, is to weaken the unions or the labor's bargaining position, so that and that was the solution that the system provided for this weird stagflation type thing that plagued the last capitalist computer. Now, a third element of why the employee's bargaining position is so weak is now the state is not so concerned with full employment any longer. It has now tipped the balance to being more concerned with taming inflation than full employment. So now you don't have this really hot labor market where folks can just move and go to a different job if they don't like the deal they're getting in one place as opposed to the other. And so that's yet another thing that just undercuts labor's bargaining position. And as a result, go to the next bullet point here, you can now, you should expect that now labor's share of national income and labor's share of productivity growth is going to go down. And, if your bargaining position gets weaker, you're going to get a smaller slice of the pie that you're bargaining over. Okay. Now, the final thing that characterizes this capitalist computer, one of the main ways in which the other computer promoted its animating ideal of full employment was through an active legislature, an active fiscal policy, spending money on big infrastructure projects. Well, and that was the way that states used to regulate their economies. That's the way they, were able to sustain this imperative. But now, legislatures have pretty much just ceded the field to governance of the economy to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve. Through a number of tools, one of those, which is to control the interest rates, the Federal Reserve is charged with sort of keeping the economy humming. The legislatures have kind of stepped out of it. They're just not spending money on these big infrastructure projects like they were. Okay, so now, Blyth makes this point over and over again. During the Great Compression era, no one knew the name of the chair of the Federal Reserve of the United States, but now that person is, is extremely well known. You can, some of you folks may have heard of Alan Greenspan or Paul Volcker. These folks are the folks that were at the commanding heights in this banking system, overseeing this economy. Okay. Now, so now we have the main features of this neoliberal capitalist computer on the table. Let's talk about the bug in the system. And here I give you an overview. The bug in the system is that it creates this precarious, anxiety-ridden economy for about 80% of the population. Now, I want to to describe this bug in a bit more detail. It's because of this bug that Blyth says that the era of neoliberalism is over. The era of neo-nationalism has just begun. This bug got out of hand, precipitating the 2008 crisis. Okay, so let's talk about the bug in the neoliberal capitalist computer. Okay, so now let's kind of think about what an economy looks like that's governed by this new computer for about 40 years, from 1980 to about 2008, which is the 2008 banking crisis. So first, I mentioned this. Let's recapitulate. There's been stagnant wages for the bottom 80 to 90%. Now, these folks in these income brackets, to make ends meet, given those stagnant wages, there's been an increase in private debt, increase in student loans, mortgages, credit cards, these kinds of things. This has been a low inflation environment, so inflation doesn't eat away the value of your debt. So it's not easy to pay this thing off. Now, at the same time, remember I mentioned all that stuff about interest rates and how the Federal Reserve has been in this low interest rate environment for the last 40 years, setting this low baseline rate on interests. Well, that's important. It's an important part of the picture, because what that does is it creates a world in which interest rates are just low enough to where people can't pay off their debts. Inflation doesn't eat them away, but they're low enough to where they can roll over their debts, and they're just, you just continually service this, your debt over your lifetime, but you never get out from under it. At the same time, even though inflation is low, there are a number of big ticket items that are getting increasingly expensive in this time period. So prices at the grocery store, certainly prices of consumer goods, they're not going up. But prices of big ticket items like education and home assets, those have gone up tremendously in the last 20 or 30 years under this computer. In the United States, healthcare is a big ticket item that's gone up quite a bit, not quite a bit, tremendously as well. So you've got this world where you're not able to, your wages aren't going up for most folks. You're under this credit card debt that you're just barely able to roll over from year to year. And the big ticket items, the big ticket items that are sort of a pathway to this more stable kind of middle class existence, like education and a home, they've gotten really expensive and kind of out of reach for many. And those who do have them, they're burdened by these huge interests, are these huge loan debts that they have to pay off for a lifetime. Now, in that environment, consumer demand is going to stagnate. Folks aren't going to have as much money to spend on stuff. Now that's a problem. Why is that a problem? It's a problem for the economy at large, because if people can't spend, if they can't demand, then there are going to be fewer investment opportunities out there for companies. The investor class is going to have a very hard time finding profits anywhere, because folks in the regular economy, they just don't have money to buy all your widgets. They're tapped out on credit. They're just kind of stagnant at this point. How much they can demand. So there aren't investment opportunities in the real economy. So what you get in this situation is you get an investor class that's chasing profits elsewhere, and they're looking for they're pouring money into things like houses. They're pouring money into things like the stock market, trying to find these rates of returns, and the things that they're chasing get riskier and riskier. In the hopes of getting that great return, and you're creating this risky sort of asset bubble type economy where that's prone to collapses of those bubbles. And in fact, what we got in 2008 is we got a massive collapse of a banking bubble, which led to what's known as the Great Recession. But to sum all this up, what you've got is you've got this precarious, anxiety-ridden economic system for about 80% of the population. Their aspirations to have as good of a life as their parents, much less a better one, have been undercut. And they're in this environment where they're just barely able to make ends meet, and they're having to service their consumer debts. It's just a tremendously precarious environment. And at the same time, they're in this world of increasing inequality, and it's conspicuous. It's obvious that some folks are doing very, very well. Those two things are explosive. This economic anxiety, this precarious economic existence, coupled with this conspicuous inequality, and makes for a very restless and angry electorate that's looking for something different. They're looking for a change. And what they're doing is they're not voting for the center-right and the center-left parties that they did in the past. So in 2008, we get this collapse in the banking system that gets bailed out by the government. But what we have is the system where the economic anxieties are still there, and the inequalities are still there. And so you have this electorate that's just ripe for something different. And that takes us to the next bit that I want to talk about, which I want to, in the next lecture, which I want to talk about populism. Populism is a response to the collapse and the bug in the neoliberal capitalist computer. And I'll say a little bit about that when I see you in the next installment. Thank you.